I stared at the letter in my hand, feeling my blood begin to boil. The audacity, the sheer unmitigated gall of these people was truly something to behold. The Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association was demanding that I remove my boat from my lake within 48 hours or face a $500 0 cents per day fine. They even threatened to have it towed at my expense. I couldn't help but laugh as I read the condescending language dripping with artificial authority. These pompous bureaucrats had no idea who they were messing with. They had been happily using my family's lake for years without permission, and now they were trying to dictate terms to me on my own property? Oh, this was going to be interesting. Where are you watching this from, by the way? Drop a comment below, because I guarantee you're about to enjoy watching these entitled HOA tyrants get exactly what they deserve in one of the most satisfying takedowns I've ever had the pleasure of executing. My name is Jake Sullivan, and until 6 months ago, I was just another overworked software engineer grinding away in Silicon Valley. I had spent the last decade building a startup that specialized in cybersecurity solutions for financial institutions. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was challenging and paid well. When a major tech conglomerate offered to buy us out for a sum with more zeros than I ever expected to see in my bank account, I decided it was time for a change of pace. I was 40 years old, financially secure, and thoroughly burned out. What I needed was peace and quiet, away from the constant hustle and endless meetings. That's when I remembered the lake house. Sullivan Lake had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather, a commercial fisherman turned conservationist, had purchased the 50-acre lake and surrounding land back in the 1950s, when the area was nothing but farmland and forests. He built a modest cabin on the shore and spent his retirement years fishing, writing, and teaching local kids about respecting nature. I still have vivid memories of summers spent at the lake with him, learning to fish and listening to his stories about the old days when the water was so clear you could see 20 feet down to the bottom. He was something of a local legend, known for standing up to a mining company that wanted to devastate the surrounding watershed. "Water is life, Jake," he'd tell me, his voice gruff but gentle, not just for fish, but for all of us. "Never let anyone tell you that profit is more important than protecting what nature gave us." Those words had stayed with me through the years, even as I pursued my career in technology thousands of miles away. My father maintained the property but rarely used it, as his work kept him traveling. He was more of a city person anyway, never quite connecting with the lake the way my grandfather and I did. When both of them passed away within 2 years of each other, my grandfather at 92 and my father unexpectedly from a heart attack at 67, the lake and the cabin became mine. I hadn't visited in almost 5 years, busy with building my company, dealing with investors, and navigating the cutthroat tech industry, but now it seemed like the perfect refuge. I had the cabin renovated, maintaining its rustic charm while adding modern amenities like reliable internet and updated plumbing, and moved in just as winter was giving way to spring. The peace I found there was exactly what I needed. Mornings spent with coffee on the dock, afternoons working on small projects around the property, and evenings watching the sunset from my small fishing boat in the middle of the lake. The stress of meetings and deadlines gradually melted away, replaced by the rhythms of nature and the simple pleasures of lake living. It was perfect. Or at least it was, until the HOA decided to flex their muscles. That morning had started like any other. I woke with the sun, made a pot of strong coffee, and took my mug down to the dock where my 16-foot aluminum fishing boat was tied up. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple, practical vessel perfect for one person to navigate the lake and do some casual fishing. It had belonged to my grandfather, and though it was a bit weathered, I'd kept it in good working condition. There was something deeply satisfying about using the same boat he had used for decades, trailing my fingers in the same water, watching the same shores. I noticed the piece of paper immediately, an obnoxious neon orange color, attached to the side of my boat with what appeared to be waterproof tape. "Violation notice," it screamed in bold black letters. I pulled it off, scanning the ridiculous content about unauthorized watercraft and aesthetic standards violations. According to this notice, my boat was inconsistent with community visual guidelines and needed to be removed from community waters. The notice also mentioned that all boats must be registered with the HOA and display appropriate community stickers. I laughed, thinking it was some kind of prank, until I walked back to the cabin and found the official letter in my mailbox, complete with HOA letterhead and the signature of one Richard Wilkins, HOA president. I was still staring at the letter when my phone rang. It was Ray Delgado, my closest neighbor and one of the few people I'd gotten to know since moving in. Ray was in his mid-70s, had known my grandfather well, and lived about a quarter-mile down the shore in a house he'd built with his own hands 50 years ago. He was a retired carpenter with calloused hands and a permanent tan from decades of outdoor work. Despite our age difference, we'd hit it off immediately when I arrived, bonding over our shared love of fishing and dislike of unnecessary rules. "Morning, Jake. I see the welcoming committee finally found you," he said with a dry chuckle when I answered. I told him about the notice and letter, and he sighed heavily. "Those HOA vultures have been getting more aggressive every year. They started building that fancy development on the north side about 10 years ago, and ever since then they've been acting like they own everything within 5 miles. Your grandfather would have run them off with a shotgun full of rock salt." The image made me smile. Grandpa Sullivan had indeed been known for his direct approach to trespassers. I asked Ray if he'd had trouble with them, too. "Oh, they tried with me once about my boat shed being unsightly. I told Richard Wilkins where he could stick his violation notice. Haven't bothered me since, but they're probably just waiting for me to die so they can harass whoever buys my place. You should know they've been using your lake for their fancy fishing tournaments for years now. They even have a private club called the Elite Anglers or some pretentious nonsense. Bunch of weekend warriors in expensive gear who couldn't catch a cold if you ask me. Your grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew they were treating his lake like their personal country club." That information startled me. I hadn't thought to check if anyone was using the lake while the property was vacant, naively assuming that respect for private property still meant something. After hanging up with Ray, I did some digging online and found exactly what he was talking about. The Maple Creek Estates HOA website prominently featured photos of their annual lakeside fishing derby, with smiling men in expensive fishing gear proudly displaying their catches on my lake. Their Elite Anglers Club even had its own page, boasting about their exclusive access to prime fishing waters and upcoming events. There were dozens of photos showing large gatherings on the eastern shore of the lake, which was definitely my property, complete with tents, barbecues, and even a temporary dock they must have installed for the events. The most recent post announced their biggest tournament of the year, scheduled for the following weekend, with a $5,000 0-cents prize and a catered lakeside barbecue. They were literally planning a massive event on my property without so much as asking permission. The audacity was breathtaking. I scrolled through years of photos and announcements, growing more incredulous with each one. They had been doing this for at least 5 years, apparently taking advantage of the fact that no one was living at the cabin full-time to gradually assert control over the lake. One post even referred to Sullivan Lake as our community's crown jewel, as if they had any right to claim it. I needed advice from someone who understood the legal implications, so I called my friend Emma Porter. Emma and I had met during college and stayed in touch over the years. She was now an environmental lawyer specializing in water rights and land use issues, exactly the expertise I needed. She had been one of the few people who understood why I'd walked away from my successful tech career to live by a lake. "Let me get this straight," she said after I explained the situation. "You own the lake, like actually own the deed to the lake bed and water rights, and they're telling you that you can't have your boat on it?" I confirmed that was exactly the case, and she burst out laughing. "Oh, this is too good. And they've been using it for events without permission? Jake, they don't have a legal leg to stand on. This is trespassing, plain and simple." I asked her what I should do. "Don't respond to their notice yet," she advised. "Let's gather some evidence first. If they've been doing this for years, we want to document everything before they have a chance to cover their tracks. I'll drive up this weekend and we can go through your deeds and property records to confirm everything's in order. In the meantime, maybe set up some security cameras around the lake. Something tells me this is going to get interesting. Oh, and Jake, don't let them take your boat. If they try to remove it, that's theft, pure and simple. Make sure you document everything." I followed Emma's advice and installed wireless security cameras at strategic points around the lake, particularly focusing on the areas where the HOA seemed to hold their events, based on the photos I'd seen online. The cameras were discreet but high resolution, with night vision capabilities and motion detection that would alert me on my phone whenever someone approached the lake. I also dug through my father's filing cabinet and found all the original deeds and property documents, confirming what I already knew. Sullivan Lake was completely, unambiguously mine, including the water rights and all land 15 feet beyond the high water mark around the entire perimeter. There was even a survey map from 2010 commissioned by my father that clearly marked the property boundaries. I was still reviewing these documents when I received an email invitation to the upcoming HOA meeting. It wasn't addressed specifically to me, it seemed to be a mass email sent to everyone in the area. Curious about what these people were like, I decided to attend as an observer. It would be my first chance to see Richard Wilkins and the HOA board in action, and I wasn't going to miss it. The meeting was held in the Maple Creek Estates Community Center, an ostentatious building with columns and a fountain out front that looked like it was trying desperately to be impressive. I slipped in quietly and took a seat in the back row. About 30 people were present, most of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Richard Wilkins was exactly what I expected, a man in his mid-50s with perfectly coiffed silver hair, wearing a blue blazer with gold buttons and a country club smile that never reached his eyes. He ran the meeting with the self-importance of a small-town dictator, droning on about lawn height regulations and approved mailbox designs. When he finally got to the topic of lake regulations, I sat up straighter. "We've had reports of an unauthorized boat being stored on community waters," he announced, a note of annoyance in his voice. "I want to remind everyone that all watercraft must be registered with the HOA and must comply with our aesthetic guidelines. The lake is one of our community's most valuable assets, and we must maintain its pristine appearance." I couldn't help myself. I raised my hand. Richard Wilkins looked surprised, clearly not accustomed to audience participation during his monologues, but nodded in my direction. "Yes, the gentleman in the back?" I stood up, keeping my tone casual and curious. "I was wondering if you could clarify something about the lake. When you say community waters, what exactly do you mean? Who owns the lake?" A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd, and I noticed a few residents turning to look at me with interest. Richard's smile tightened just a fraction. "The lake is a community resource under HOA management. It's been that way since the development was established." His tone was dismissive, clearly intending to shut down the conversation, but I wasn't finished. I pressed further. "So, the HOA has a deed to the lake? Or is it owned by the county and managed by the HOA through some kind of agreement?" Several residents were now paying close attention, and I saw one older man nodding thoughtfully at my question. Richard was getting visibly uncomfortable, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edges of the podium. "There are historical arrangements in place. The specific details aren't relevant to this meeting, but I assure you the HOA has full authority to regulate all activities on the lake." His tone had turned sharp, but I kept my expression innocently curious. "That's interesting. I'd love to see those documents sometime." Just out of curiosity. Richard quickly moved on to the next agenda item, but not before I noticed him exchanging a concerned glance with a woman I would later learn was Karen Mitchell, the HOA vice president. For the remainder of the meeting, I felt their eyes on me periodically, no doubt wondering who I was and why I was asking questions about the lake. After the meeting, as people were gathering their things and heading out, I was approached by a man who introduced himself as Gerald Thompson, president of the Elite Anglers Club. He was in his 60s, with the weathered face of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors and the confident handshake of someone used to getting his way. He wore an expensive fishing vest over a polo shirt and a hat emblazoned with the club's logo. "Haven't seen you around before, you must be new to the neighborhood," he said, sizing me up with a practiced smile. I explained that I had recently moved into my family's property on the lake. His eyebrows shot up. "The old Sullivan place? That's been empty for years. We thought it might be abandoned." There was something calculating in his expression that made me wary. I assured him it most certainly wasn't abandoned and was still very much Sullivan property. "I'm Jake Sullivan, by the way. My grandfather built that cabin." Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Sullivan, of course. I met your grandfather once, years ago. Quite a character." The way he said character made it clear it wasn't a compliment. He seemed to choose his next words carefully. "Well, welcome to the area. You should know we have a wonderful fishing club. Very exclusive, but I might be able to get you in. We have access to the best spots on the lake." The irony of him offering me access to my own lake was almost too much to bear, but I maintained my poker face. "That sounds interesting. When's your next event?" He beamed with pride. "Our annual championship is next Saturday. Biggest event of the year, right on the East Shore. You should come by and see what we're all about." I thanked him for the invitation, already planning how I would use this upcoming tournament to gather more evidence of their trespassing. I thanked him for the invitation and was about to leave when I overheard Richard Wilkins speaking in hushed tones to Gerald and Karen Mitchell near the refreshment table. I busied myself with a cup of mediocre coffee, straining to hear their conversation. I couldn't hear everything, but the phrases "accelerate the timeline" and "deal with the Sullivan situation before it's too late" definitely reached my ears. Karen glanced in my direction and they lowered their voices further, moving away from the table. Whatever they were planning, it clearly involved my property, and they were concerned about my unexpected appearance. As I walked to my car, I decided to call Emma again and update her on what I'd learned. They're definitely hiding something, she agreed. The fact that Wilkins wouldn't directly answer your question about ownership is telling, and this timeline they mentioned, that sounds like they have some kind of development plan in the works. Let's go through those documents of yours tomorrow when I arrive. I was about to drive home when I noticed a sleek BMW pulling up beside me in the parking lot. The window rolled down to reveal Richard Wilkins himself. Mr. Sullivan, isn't it? I realized we weren't properly introduced. I'm Richard Wilkins, president of the Maple Creek Estates HOA. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. I understand you've recently moved into the old cabin on the lake. We should have a chat about bringing it up to community standards. I matched his fake smile with one of my own. I wasn't aware that my property fell under your HOA jurisdiction, Mr. Wilkins. His smile didn't falter, but something flashed in his eyes. Irritation, perhaps, or concern. All properties in this area are part of our community vision, Mr. Sullivan. We pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards. Your boat, for instance, is somewhat rustic for our tastes. He practically spat the word rustic, as if my grandfather's well-maintained fishing boat was somehow offensive. I decided to play dumb a little longer. Is that right? And what authority does the HOA have over boats on the lake? Richard's smile tightened further. As I mentioned in the meeting, the lake is under HOA management. It has been for years. He waved his hand dismissively, as if this should settle the matter. I nodded thoughtfully. That's fascinating, because according to my family's deed, Sullivan Lake is private property, owned by the Sullivan family since 1953. Has something changed that I'm not aware of? For just a moment, Richard's mask slipped, and I saw a flash of genuine concern before he recovered. There seemed to be some misunderstandings about historical arrangements. Perhaps we should have our lawyers discuss this directly. In the meantime, I hope you'll comply with our request regarding your boat. It would be a shame to start our relationship on the wrong foot. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. I just smiled and told him I'd take his concerns under advisement. As he drove away, I had the distinct feeling that the battle lines had just been drawn. When I got home, I discovered that Richard Wilkins hadn't wasted any time. My boat was gone from the dock, with nothing but a property violation notice left in its place. The notice stated that the boat had been impounded for non-compliance with community standards and could be reclaimed after paying a $750.00 fine and signing a compliance agreement. The document specified that the boat would be considered abandoned and sold at auction if not claimed within 30 days. I was livid, pacing the dock and fighting the urge to drive straight back to Wilkins' office and confront him. Instead, I took several deep breaths and remembered what my grandfather always said. When you're angry, that's when you need to slow down and think clearer than ever. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about standing up to bullies who had been taking advantage of my family's property for years. I called the local sheriff's office to report the theft, only to be told that this was considered a civil matter between me and the HOA. The deputy I spoke with seemed uncomfortable, mentioning that these HOA disputes can get complicated, and suggesting I try to work things out directly with the association. His reluctance to get involved made me wonder if the HOA had friends in the sheriff's department, or if they had simply convinced local law enforcement that they had authority they didn't actually possess. By the time Emma arrived the next morning, I had moved from anger to cold, calculated determination. We spent the day going through all my documents, spreading them out on the cabin's large dining table. Emma's legal expertise was invaluable as we confirmed beyond any doubt that I had clear title to the lake and surrounding property. These deeds are ironclad, she said, studying the legal language. Your grandfather was thorough in establishing the property boundaries, and your father's survey reinforces it. Emma also discovered something interesting in the county records she had pulled before driving up. The original Maple Creek Estates development plans explicitly acknowledged that Sullivan Lake was private property and not part of the development. They've been lying to their own residents, Emma said, tapping the document with her finger. Based on these records, they never had any right to regulate lake usage or access. They've basically been trespassing all these years. We also reviewed the security camera footage I'd set up, which had already captured several residents launching boats from what they clearly thought was HOA property, but was actually my land. This is great evidence, Emma said. Now we need to figure out what their endgame is. There's something bigger happening here than just harassing you about your boat. From what you overheard about accelerating the timeline, they seem to be working towards something specific. Our answer came later that afternoon when Ray Delgado stopped by with an interesting piece of information. My niece works for the county planning department, he said. She called me this morning because she saw a preliminary application come across her desk. Maple Creek Estates is seeking approval for a major expansion, a luxury lakeside resort with condos, a marina, and a golf course. Guess which lake they're planning to build it on? The pieces started falling into place. Richard Wilkins and his cronies weren't just being petty tyrants. They were setting up for a multi-million-dollar development project on land they didn't own. They had probably been planning this for years, gradually establishing the fiction that the HOA controlled the lake, likely assuming that the Sullivan family had either forgotten about the property or would be willing to sell. My unexpected return and questions about ownership had thrown a massive wrench in their plans. Emma and I began formulating our strategy that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with takeout from the local diner. "We could go nuclear right away," she said, twirling a fork in her pasta, "send a cease and desist, file trespassing charges against the HOA, and demand the immediate return of your boat, but that might be showing our hand too early." I agreed, sipping my beer thoughtfully. "I want to know more about what they're planning and who else is involved. Let's hold off on direct confrontation for now." Instead, we decided on a more subtle approach. Emma drafted a letter to the HOA board requesting copies of all documents pertaining to lake ownership and management, as well as information about the Elite Anglers Club's usage of the lake. The letter was carefully worded to sound like a reasonable request for information rather than a challenge to their authority. This will put them on notice that someone is asking questions, but it doesn't reveal that we know about the development plans, Emma explained. We also decided to let the upcoming fishing tournament proceed as planned, with security cameras recording everything. The more evidence we had of them using my property without permission, the stronger our position would be when we finally dropped the hammer. In the meantime, I received a formal letter from Steve Barnes, the HOA's attorney, reiterating the demand to comply with HOA regulations and threatening legal action if I continued to interfere with community operations. The letter was full of vague references to historical precedent and established community standards, but conspicuously lacked any specific citation of legal authority over my property. Emma helped me draft a response that acknowledged receipt of their letter but committed to nothing, buying us more time. "This is actually helpful," she said as we finalized the wording. "It shows they're getting nervous but don't have any real legal basis for their claims. If they had actual documentation supporting their position, their lawyer would have cited it specifically." I also reached out to Sarah Lynn, a reporter with the local newspaper who Ray mentioned had done stories on HOA overreach in the past. We met for coffee at a small cafe in town, far enough from Maple Creek Estates to avoid being seen by any HOA members. Sarah was in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and the kind of focused attention that good journalists have, listening intently as I shared some of what was happening, being careful not to reveal our full strategy. "So they've been using your lake for years without permission, and now they're trying to stop you from using your own boat on it," she summarized. "That's classic HOA overreach, but there seems to be more to this story." Sarah was immediately interested, especially when I mentioned the resort development plans. "I've been hearing rumors about a big project, but no one would go on record," she said, scribbling notes. "If they're planning to build on private property without the owner's consent, that's a major story." I asked her to hold off on publishing anything just yet, but to keep her ear to the ground about the development plans and the investors behind them. The day before the fishing tournament, Richard Wilkins appeared at my door, unannounced. I had just finished my morning coffee and was reviewing some of the security camera footage when the doorbell rang. His demeanor was different this time, less arrogant, more conciliatory. He ditched the blazer for a more casual button-down shirt, probably trying to appear more approachable. "Mr. Sullivan, I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said, with that same practiced smile. "I understand you're concerned about your boat. I'm sure we can work something out." I invited him in, curious to hear what he had to say. He made a show of admiring the renovated cabin, commenting on the rustic charm with barely concealed condescension. "The HOA is willing to make an exception for your boat," he continued, settling into my living room sofa. "You can keep it on the lake, no problem. All we ask is that you sign this simple agreement acknowledging the HOA's management role regarding lake activities." He handed me a document that essentially asked me to recognize the HOA's authority over Sullivan Lake in exchange for being allowed to keep my boat there. It was so transparently self-serving that I almost laughed in his face. Instead, I asked innocently, "And what about the fishing tournament tomorrow? Would that be covered under this agreement too?" Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know about that?" I shrugged casually. "Gerald Thompson invited me to come watch. Sounds like a big event." Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, it's a community tradition, been happening for years." There was a wariness in his expression now, as if he was recalculating the situation. I looked at the agreement again, pretending to consider it. "And this resort development I've been hearing about, the one that's supposed to be built on the lake shore, would this agreement cover that too?" Richard couldn't quite hide his surprise. I'm not sure what you've heard, but any development plans would go through proper channels. This agreement is just about basic lake usage guidelines. He waved his hand dismissively, trying to downplay the significance, but his body language had become tense. I handed the document back to him. I'll need to have my lawyer review this. She's been quite interested in the lake's legal status. Richard's friendly facade slipped for just a moment. Mr. Sullivan, I'm trying to be reasonable here. It would be in everyone's best interest if we could resolve this amicably. There are economic opportunities that could benefit you as well, if you're willing to be cooperative. There it was, the implied bribe. I kept my expression neutral. I'll think about it, Mr. Winkins. In the meantime, I'd appreciate the return of my boat. He stood up, clearly displeased with how the conversation had gone. I'll see what I can do, but understand that cooperation goes both ways. The HOA has been managing this lake for many years, and we have substantial community support. It would be unfortunate if this turned into a prolonged dispute. The threat was thinly veiled. After he left, I called Emma to update her. He practically admitted they have no legal claim, I told her, and he hinted at bringing me in on whatever development deal they're planning. Emma wasn't surprised. Classic move. Try to intimidate first, then offer to cut you in when that doesn't work. The tournament tomorrow is going to be interesting. We finalized our plan for the fishing tournament. Emma would attend as my guest, and we would document everything but not interfere. The real action would come after. The morning of the tournament dawned clear and sunny, perfect fishing weather. From my cabin, I watched as trucks pulling boats began arriving at the eastern shore of the lake. Gerald Thompson was directing operations, setting up tents, tables, and even a temporary bar. A large banner proclaimed 15th Annual Elite Anglers Championship with the Maple Creek Estates logo prominently displayed. There must have been at least 20 vehicles parked on my property already, with more arriving by the minute. Emma arrived mid-morning, and we watched the proceedings from my deck with binoculars. They're not even trying to be discreet, she remarked, as more and more people gathered. I count at least 40 people and 15 boats, all on your property. Around noon, Richard Wilkins arrived with several well-dressed individuals who definitely weren't there for fishing. They were carrying portfolios and gesturing toward different areas of the shoreline. Those must be the investors, Emma said. He's showing them the proposed development site. We grabbed our cameras with telephoto lenses and moved closer, staying hidden among the trees on my property. We could now hear snippets of Richard's pitch to the investors. Prime lakefront location, exclusive access, already control the entire waterfront, just need to finalize a few details. He was showing them glossy brochures with renderings of what looked like a massive resort complex. One of the investors, a woman in an expensive suit, asked about existing property owners. Richard's answer was revealing. Minimal issues. Most of the shoreline is undeveloped. There's one holdout we're in negotiations with, but that should be resolved soon. We've effectively managed the lake for years. Establishing formal control is just a formality at this point. He was completely misrepresenting the situation, acting as if he had authority he didn't possess, and implying that I was almost on board with their plans. The group moved on, studying what appeared to be preliminary architectural renderings. Satisfied we had enough evidence, Emma and I retreated to finalize our plan. It was time to end this charade. While the fishing tournament was in full swing, with boats scattered across the lake and a large crowd enjoying the barbecue on shore, we put our plan into action. First, Emma filed an emergency injunction with the county court, using our evidence to establish clear ownership of the lake and immediate threat of harm through unauthorized use. The judge, reviewing the overwhelming evidence of my ownership and the HOA's trespassing, granted the injunction immediately. With that legal protection in place, I hired a local security company to post private property no trespassing signs around the entire lake perimeter, focusing particularly on the tournament area. Then, with a sheriff's deputy accompanying us to keep the peace, Emma and I approached the gathering. The deputy called for attention, and suddenly all eyes were on us as he announced that this assembly was taking place on private property without the owner's permission, and everyone was being asked to vacate immediately. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Gerald Thompson rushed over, face red with anger and confusion. "What the hell is this? We've been holding this tournament for 15 years. Emma stepped forward, cool and professional. "Mr. Thompson, Sullivan Lake is private property owned by Mr. Sullivan. The HOA has never had legal authority to grant access or permission for events on this lake. We have an injunction from Judge Harmon confirming this fact and ordering all unauthorized persons to vacate the premises immediately." She held up the court document, which seemed to carry more weight than our verbal assertions. Richard Wilkins pushed through the crowd, his investors watching with concern from the sidelines. "This is ridiculous. The lake has been under HOA management for decades," he was practically shouting, his carefully cultivated composure completely gone. Emma handed him a copy of the injunction and my property deed. "That is demonstrably false, Mr. Wilkins. The county records clearly show the Sullivan family has maintained continuous ownership since 1953. Your HOA has been trespassing all these years. Furthermore, we have evidence that you've been misrepresenting your authority to potential investors, which could constitute fraud." The crowd of anglers and spectators began murmuring among themselves, many looking confused and upset. One man stepped forward, identifying himself as a Maple Creek Estates resident. "We were told our HOA fees included lake maintenance and access rights. Are you saying we've been lied to?" His questions seemed to capture what many were thinking, as several others nodded in agreement. Emma nodded sympathetically. "I'm afraid so. The documents we've reviewed showed the HOA has been misrepresenting its authority over this lake for years." More residents began asking questions, their anger now directed at Richard and the HOA board members present. The investors were already retreating to their cars, clearly wanting no part of this public confrontation. The sheriff's deputy raised his voice above the growing tumult. "Folks, I need everyone to begin packing up their equipment and vacating the property in an orderly fashion. The court order is clear and I'm here to enforce it." Gerald Thompson was still protesting, but people were already beginning to dismantle the tents and load their gear. Richard Wilkins pulled me aside, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "You have no idea what you've just done, Sullivan. I have connections in this county you couldn't imagine. This isn't over." His attempt at intimidation might have worked on someone else, but after years of high-stakes business negotiations in Silicon Valley, his threat seemed almost laughable. I met his gaze calmly. "Actually, Richard, I think it is, but if you want to continue, you should know I have recordings of you telling your investors that you control my lake and are in negotiations with me. That sounds an awful lot like fraud to me. I wonder what they'll think when they learn the truth." His face paled slightly, and he glanced over at the now departing investors who were clearly unhappy with the turn of events. "This was just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice losing some of its confidence. "We can work something out." I shook my head. "The time for working things out was before you stole my boat and tried to steal my lake. Now, I'll need to ask you to leave my property." As the crowd dispersed and the last boats were loaded onto trailers, Sarah Lynn arrived with a photographer. She had been tipped off about the confrontation and was eager for comments. Richard and the other HOA board members refused to speak to her, hurrying to their cars, but several residents were more than happy to express their outrage at learning they had been misled about the lake rights. "We pay over $500 0 cents a month in HOA fees," one woman told Sarah, "and they told us part of that was for lake maintenance and access rights. If they don't actually own the lake, where has that money been going?" It was a good question, and from the murmurs of agreement around her, many residents were wondering the same thing. Sarah approached me for my side of the story, and I gave her a matter-of-fact account of the HOA's actions and my response, showing her the property deeds and the court injunction. "So what happens next?" she asked, her pen poised over her notebook. I looked out over my now empty lake, peaceful again after the chaos. "Next, I get my boat back, and then we'll see what other surprises Mr. Wilkins has been hiding from his residents." The aftermath was swift and far-reaching. Sarah's article ran on the front page of the local paper the next day, detailing the HOA's years of deception and the failed resort development scheme. By evening, it had been picked up by regional news outlets and was spreading on social media. The HOA called an emergency meeting, which I attended along with Emma and many angry residents. Richard Wilkins was conspicuously absent, with Karen Mitchell attempting to manage the hostile crowd. The residents demanded to know what other lies they had been told and where their HOA fees had really been going. Emma and I watched quietly from the back as the HOA board crumbled under the pressure, with multiple members resigning on the spot. I finally stood up and addressed the gathering. "I don't have a problem with Maple Creek Estates residents enjoying the lake for recreation. My issue was with the HOA leadership claiming authority they didn't have and planning to develop my property without my consent. Perhaps we can work out a new arrangement that respects property rights while allowing responsible community access." My statement calmed some of the tension in the room, and several residents approached me afterward to apologize for the situation and express interest in finding a fair solution. One older gentleman shook my hand firmly. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. "He always let the local kids fish from his shore, you know. Never turned anyone away who respected the lake." I hadn't known that. and the comment touched me deeply. Meanwhile, Emma's legal work was bearing additional fruit. Based on the documentation we had gathered and the public outcry following Sarah's article, the county launched an investigation into the HOA's finances. They were particularly interested in where the money collected for lake maintenance had actually gone over the years. Additionally, Richard Wilkins' development partners filed a lawsuit against him for misrepresentation after learning he had been negotiating to sell them access to property he didn't own. My boat was returned the following day, with a grudging apology from the HOA's new acting president, who had been elected hastily after the mass resignations. The local sheriff's office, embarrassed by their earlier dismissal of my complaint, assigned a deputy to patrol the lake regularly to prevent further trespassing until a more permanent solution could be established. 2 weeks later, Sarah Lynn called with an update that brought everything full circle. "You're not going to believe this," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "I did some digging into Richard Wilkins' background. He's not even a real estate broker like he claimed. He had his license revoked in Florida 5 years ago for similar schemes, misrepresenting property boundaries and selling access rights he didn't own. He changed his name slightly and moved here to start fresh." She explained that in Florida he had operated under the name Richard Williams and had been involved in several sketchy development deals before being caught. He barely avoided criminal charges in Florida by settling with the victims, but it looks like his luck has run out here. I've shared all this with the county prosecutor. It explains so much about his confidence in the scheme and his panic when challenged. The county prosecutor was now reviewing the evidence for possible criminal charges of fraud and misappropriation of HOA funds. Richard Wilkins had disappeared, reportedly leaving town in the middle of the night as the walls closed in around him. Karen Mitchell, when confronted with this information, claimed she had no idea about his background, but emails recovered during the investigation suggested otherwise. Over the next few months, I worked with the remaining HOA board members and residents to establish a new relationship with the community. The new board was led by the older gentleman who had mentioned my grandfather, a retired judge named Michael Davis, who had moved to Maple Creek Estates for a peaceful retirement, only to find himself thrust into a leadership role. He was honest and straightforward, qualities sorely lacking in the previous administration. Together, we created the Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, a non-profit organization that would manage controlled public access to parts of the lake while preserving the natural environment my grandfather had fought to protect. Residents could purchase reasonable annual access permits, with the funds going toward lake maintenance and conservation efforts. "This is how it should have been done from the beginning," Judge Davis said during one of our planning meetings. "Honest, transparent, and respectful of property rights." I even allowed a reformed version of the fishing club to continue their tournaments, now with proper permissions and environmental guidelines. Gone were the exclusive membership requirements and exorbitant fees. The new Sullivan Lake Anglers was open to anyone who respected the lake and followed the conservation rules we established. Gerald Thompson, unsurprisingly, wanted nothing to do with the new arrangement and moved away shortly after the scandal broke. The eastern shore, where Richard had planned his resort development, was instead dedicated as a small public park with a modest fishing pier and picnic area open to all community members. On the day we opened the park, I placed a plaque honoring my grandfather, with his favorite saying, "Water is life, not a commodity to be bought and sold." As for my boat, I finally got around to repainting it and making some repairs, but I kept it deliberately rustic as a reminder of where this all began. On quiet mornings, I still take it out to the middle of the lake with a fishing rod and a cup of coffee, just as my grandfather did. Sometimes Ray Delgado joins me, sharing stories about the old days and how my grandfather would have handled the HOA situation, usually involving more colorful language and less legal finesse than my approach. Emma stopped by regularly, proud of what we accomplished together and keeping an eye out for any new threats to the lake's tranquility. She helped establish the legal framework for the Conservation Trust, ensuring it would protect the lake long after I'm gone. The no trespassing signs came down, replaced by Sullivan Lake Conservation Area markers that set out reasonable usage rules while acknowledging the lake's private ownership. Sometimes the sweetest victory isn't just defeating your enemies, but transforming a battle into an opportunity to build something better. As I sit in my boat watching families enjoy the new lakeside park and responsible anglers respectfully fishing the waters, I can't help but think my grandfather would be proud. He always said the lake wasn't just for one person, it was a treasure to be protected for everyone who would appreciate it properly. The HOA tyrants who tried to steal it have been replaced by a community that respects both the natural resource and the rights of those who steward it. Richard Wilkins' grand plan for luxury condos and exclusive access has instead become a model for how private ownership and public benefit can coexist with the right approach. Last week, I found an old photograph of my grandfather standing on the dock with his fishing boat, the same boat that started this whole ordeal. He's smiling broadly, holding up a large bass with the lake stretching out behind him. I had it framed and hung it in the cabin's living room. Every time I look at it, I'm reminded of his wisdom and determination, qualities I hope I've inherited, at least in part. And every time I take my non-compliant boat out onto my very own lake, I can't help but smile at how it all turned out. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting what's yours, it's about showing others a better way forward. The lake is healthier now than it has been in years, with clearer water and more abundant wildlife. Proof that proper stewardship works better than unchecked development. As my grandfather would say, take care of the water and the water takes care of everything else. Words to live by, especially when dealing with entitled HOAs who don't know their place.